Janey Lee Grace. Welcome to the Natural Health and Sobriety Show on UK Health Radio. Hi, and welcome to the show. I hope you're having a wonderful festive season, whichever part you're at this point. And I thought what would be nice is to rerun a couple of sections from some of my favourite interviews, and particularly ones that are sort of feel quite important at this kind of time of year. So in the Sober Club that I run, we did a session with Jo Creed, who is queen of NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, and just looked at what we can do when we feel as though we've made a decision. We want something. Maybe we want to stop drinking. Perhaps we want to quit sugar. Perhaps we want to change our behaviours. And yet somehow there's a voice in our head that tells us to do the opposite. So we did a session on how we can do what we say we want to do. So I thought, well, for this time of year, perfect. Let's have a little bit of that. It's Jo Creed.
When we think about something that we want to do, we need to think about, so NLP looks at things like our meta programs. So things like what really motivates us. That's one area that it looks at. So a tiny little bit of that is, for example, if we want to think about, we want to ditch the booze, we want to give up drinking or whatever, we very often think, oh, okay, I've got this problem. I feel tired all the time. You know, I don't like the way I feel. I don't like the way I look when I'm drinking. So that's our problem side of it. Mm. But some of the reason why we don't then maintain, or reach where we want to go is we haven't really thought through what we want to achieve when we've moved away from the problem. So we've not really envisaged, and NLP gives us ways to be able to really, really connect with what's it going to be like in the future, and bring that, get that really emotional connection and that visual connection with how it is. So that's just one tiny way. And if we think about the whole thing around booze, it looks at things like, okay, what's the habit? You know, is the habit when, you come home from work and, you've had a hard day and immediately you're drawn to, a glass of whatever. With NLP, what you can really understand is, okay, what is it that's happening that's triggering me, and how can I resource myself to basically collapse that trigger so the trigger doesn't have the emotional response from me and that need to go forward. I mean, do you want me to just sort of cover a couple of little things?
Yeah, could you? That'd be brilliant. Yeah, thank you.
As we're just before Christmas.
Yeah,
maybe
exactly.
We could also talk about, obviously this relates to whenever. One thing we look at in NLP is also ways of being able to communicate to ourselves what we need and to other people for what you need. The way I train, I incorporate NLP and also something that's called clean language, which is a real way of utilising your language with other people to get deep, but also to utilise it with yourself. So, for example, if you think about Christmas, think about actually, what is it I really want? How do I want Christmas to really be? How do I want this occasion to really be when it's at the best it can be? Yeah. How do I really want that to be? And actually connect with that. Think about it. What is it? What would it be like? What would I be seeing? What would I be hearing? How would I be feeling when Christmas is how I would want it to be? Okay. And then you think, okay, so how do I need to be in order to get that?
And that's a really important bit that I love about NLP. When you bring in that question, you have to actually take some responsibility, don't you? Rather than just going, well, I want it all to be marvellous. You know, you have to actually ask yourself, how do I have to be?
How do I have to be in order to do it? And then the third question on this little, so it's called a clean setup, this little series of questions is, okay, in order for Christmas to be like that, in order for me to be like that, to get Christmas to be like that, what support do I need from other people? What do you really need from other people to help you? And then it's a good idea to kind of list it down and then to have that conversation and tell people, because we often think people are mind readers, that they know what it is that we want. But unless we communicate with them and explain to them, so for me, this is how I want Christmas. I know for me, this is how I know it to be. And this is what I need from you. I'm asking you to give me this specific support that I need. So think about it. What would really help you? That's a great one as well.
Yeah, and I can really see how that can make a massive difference, because you're right. There's a lot of people who have stopped drinking. There'll be a lot of people listening to this who perhaps a couple of weeks in, or maybe a week or whatever, and they do want to carry on, and they really do feel committed to that, but they can be feeling very wobbly about Christmas, because Christmas throws up, as you say, all these different emotions, different triggers. Suddenly out of the blue, you hear a Christmas song, or you're putting the tree up, and it's like, oh, hold on, this is the moment when I have a Baileys, or this is when I have this. And it's such a strong trigger that if you haven't prepped ahead, you're absolutely right. You could find yourself just hitting that fuck it button right there. Just like, oh, fuck it. I haven't got anything else. It'll be all right. It'll just be one. And then, and then you're down that slippery slope. Whereas if you've thought it through and visualized yourself, as you say, visualize yourself putting up the tree or whatever it is you do, holding something lovely that's alcohol free, or whatever it is for you, you can absolutely get past that. But as we were saying before, the how do I have to be is for me, that's the real key. And that's usually the one that gets missed out, right?
Yeah, it is. And it's really connecting with that and going, okay, when I'm at my best, what is that really like? How do I feel? Where is that feeling? What do I see? How do I breathe even when you're really, really like, you at your best and how I need to be? And then it's thinking about, okay, if I start so you think about the support you need. It's also thinking about the support that you need from yourself. Yeah. So, for example, if you feel like, okay, someone's triggered me. I know great Auntie Myrtle said the thing that she always says at Christmas, that makes me want to, okay. What can I do? Give yourself permission to do something. If it means permission to walk outside, go into the loo and scream and then come out again, give yourself permission to do what you need to do. If it's permission to give the dog a quick walk around the garden or up and down the street, give yourself permission to do what you need to do to support yourself as well. Yeah.
And I think there's this sort of fine line, isn't there, really, between that kind of taking responsibility and self-care. But then, of course, one of the problems that a lot of people listening to this will have is that they're people pleasers. And they actually find themselves doing something they don't want to do just because they want to make someone else feel better. And certainly when it comes to alcohol, you'd be amazed the stories I hear. I had a client today who said to me that she really put the work in and prepped ahead for an event she's going to. But when she let people know, when she gave them a heads up, someone actually wrote back to her and said, you've made me feel really sad, really sad. Like, why would it make you feel sad that I'm not putting, toxic poison in my mouth? But unfortunately, that's the culture we live in, right? And so there's a danger that if we are real big time people pleasers, we can end up doing something we don't want to do because we want to be nice to someone else.
And I think that very much happens. A lot of what we talk about with that people pleaser is actually what we're doing was we're coming in as rescuer on the whole drama triangle. The interesting thing is very often when we're people pleasing, what we're also doing at the same time is we are gold medal mind readers. We mind read what it is the other person. So actually, if someone gives you a comment, or somebody's pushing you to do something that you don't want to do, the first thing to remember is, be honest, that's their stuff.
Exactly.
It's their stuff. What they're doing to try and push you is actually trying to give themselves something. Yeah. An excuse or whatever. It could be anything, but it is their stuff. And the other thing is, if they do say something, it's a good thing to kind of like do this little step back and imagine that you don't know them, that you may be, you're a little alien sitting in the corner, and be curious about actually what's going on for them. So, for example, the person you were talking about when someone said that makes me feel so sad, I'd go back to them with, okay, I'm curious. What is it about me deciding I don't want to drink that makes you feel sad? And actually be curious, because chances are it's about them.
Yeah, absolutely.
underneath the surface for them. So if you use that, I'm curious, what is it about? Yeah. I'm curious. You keep encouraging me to have a drink. What is going on? I'm curious what's going on for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this is what's great about NLP, isn't it? Is that it really helps you to notice your thoughts rather than just railroading through all the emotions and then reaching for a drink or whatever it is. You have to actually pause and notice.
Yeah, absolutely. Notice what's going on. And also, there's a great saying in NLP, it's going, what happened just before? Yeah. So we can feel something or feel a pull towards something or whatever. What actually happened just before? Because it's the just before that's the trigger. Okay. And it's a bit like, I love the analogy with NLP. It's a bit like looking out of a different window, taking a different view. You go, okay, is there another way I could look at that actually would empower me more?
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
The other thing is, this when people give you their stuff, their comments, and recognizing it's their stuff. It's, if you were, I don't know many people on the call have got dogs, for example. Okay, but even if you have or haven't, if you're going out for a walk with your dog, okay, or just walking through the park, and you see somebody else with a dog, big Great Dane or something, and the dog does a poop on the path. Do you go running up with your poo bag and pick up that dog's poo? We don't, do we? That's the responsibility of the person that's actually walking the dog. And yet we spend our life picking up other people's poo.
Yeah.
Don't we? It's their stuff.
Really true. Really true. We feel responsible for their poop.
We do.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, you were saying about, this being the life and soul of the party and the triggers and everything else that's going. One thing that we do in NLP is we also very much learn from, we have a saying, another saying is we all have the resources we need, but sometimes we bury them and we learn to forget them and bury them, put them aside through stuff that happens in life. Okay. If you think about kids, okay, look at a 7-year-old, 8-year-old kid, or remember how you were when you were, okay, how you were and could enjoy yourself. You could play, you could have fun, you could do all of that. I mean, I don't know many 6, 7, 8-year-old kids that need more than a glass of lemonade to do that.
Absolutely.
So remember, you have that. You have the ability to be able to play and have fun. Sometimes we just need to be a bit childish and rather than go, oh, as an adult, I need these things to allow me to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's quite interesting, isn't it? Because, the other thing about Christmas and kind of holiday time is that many of us get to see family members. And it's really interesting how, fully grown adults become children again and start reverting to those kind of patterns and even find themselves coming out with quite kind of horrible things just because they're being triggered at being with their parents. I mean, that's an interesting one. I think everybody needs a dose of NLP before they meet their family.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to deal with all that tonight. We probably haven't got time on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Families to trigger you and everything.
Yeah.
And there is a little tip that you can do that. Okay, if you kind of think about, okay, so I'm reacting against so-and-so with this emotion like frustration or anger. You can kind of go, okay, how would I rather react instead? Okay. And you can do something. Yeah, it's a bit along the playful. It might look a bit weird, but you can even do it in the moment or just walk out for a moment. And we call it power posing. For any of you that have seen the Amy Cuddy TEDx talk, she talks about power posing. Actually allowing ourselves to physically getting a strong, like standing there in a Wonder Woman pose with your hands on your hips. Just allowing yourself a few seconds to just really breathe deeply, look up. Looking up is a great one as well. Really look up to the ceiling, breathe deeply. Just get your physiology nice and strong. Just for a few seconds is enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And therefore that can really resource you as
yeah,
well.
It's brilliant. Really brings you back to in this moment, I'm safe, I'm okay. I don't need to have to pretend that I'm 5 years old again, right? Brilliant. Jo, thank you. I really appreciate it. I know you've got some free events coming up, which I'll put in the show notes, links for people. So I really appreciate your tips and thank you for doing this piece for us in the Sober Club.
You're very welcome.
Jo Creed from Beyond NLP. And don't forget, as part of my Sober Coach training program, we do lots of NLP. And in fact, Jo is one of our guest experts. Now, the other thing that you will have heard me talk about a lot, if you're a fan of this show or my Alcohol Free Life podcast, is family constellations. It really did change my life. I'm so very grateful that family constellations enabled me to have a really, really good relationship with my mother. Certainly for the last 30 years of her life. She's just passed, and I just feel so unbelievably grateful to family constellations. And earlier in the year, I got to chat to Mark Wolynn, who is the author of It Didn't Start With You. Just such a fantastic book. I now have trained in family constellations, and I'm offering workshops. We have a workshop in Hertfordshire in January, so drop me a message if that's of interest. But I thought, yet again, we'll take a little section of that interview that I did with Mark and ask him to explain what is inherited family trauma. I am such a huge fan of Family Constellations work and have spoken about it a fair bit on the podcast. But, to actually have some of this stuff really, really delved deep into in a book like this is so special. You've really done an amazing job with this book.
Thank you.
So for anyone who really has not got any clue what we're talking about, can you define for us then what inherited family trauma is?
Well, let's say one of our parents or grandparents had a significant trauma. They lost their mother or their father when they were young, or our mother or father, they were sent away, they were raised by a relative, they were placed in an orphanage, or maybe one of their siblings died tragically when they were young. And an event like this can break the heart of the family. But the reaction to the trauma doesn't necessarily stop with the people who experienced it. For example, the feelings, the sensation, specifically the stress response, the way the genes express, this can pass forward to the children and the grandchildren, affecting them in a similar way, even though they didn't personally experience the trauma.
It's incredible, isn't it? And I know it's only in relatively recent years that we've sort of started talking about this whole field of epigenetics and what it really means. And I was really struck when I read your book, when you explained something that I ought to have known, but I don't think I did know, that, just explain to us how, for a woman giving birth to a daughter, there's the grandmother's eggs in there as well. Right.
So when our grandmother is 5 months pregnant with our mother will have all the eggs. The female cell line, the egg line, stops dividing in the 5th month of pregnancy. So all the eggs that our mother has and she'll ever have will be embedded in her womb while she's embedded in our grandmother's womb. And of course, one of those eggs in our mother's womb is then us.
Yeah.
So really, you can look at in a way where 3 generations are sharing the same biological environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, tell us how this is kind of based in science, this stuff, in scientific research.
Okay. So as infants, we don't enter the world with a clean hard drive. You would think we do. They used to think we did. We entered the world that way. But to continue with this computer analogy, there seems to be an operating system already in place, one that contains the fallout from the traumas that our parents or grandparents experienced. And then here we are born with fears and feelings that don't always belong to us. And when we look at the science, the trauma, a trauma in general, it changes us.
Yeah.
Literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA. And this can change how our genes function, sometimes for generations. So technically, after this traumatic event, there'll be a chemical tag that attaches to our DNA and tells our cells to use or ignore certain genes so we can better deal with this trauma that just took place. And then the way our genes are affected changes how we act or feel. For example, we can become sensitive or reactive to situations that are similar to the original trauma, even if that trauma occurred in a past generation, so that we have a better chance of surviving it in this generation. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
If our grandparents came from a war-torn country, so let's say people are being shot or bombs are going off or uniformed men are lining people up in the square and people are being taken away, our grandparents would develop and pass forward a particular skill set designed to help them deal with that trauma. So let's say they would develop a skill set of sharper reflexes or quicker reaction times or reactions to the violence they experienced or the violence they witnessed to help them survive this trauma. Well, that's what they're, in essence, passing forward. Now, the problem is, here we are in the next generation inheriting a stress response with the dials set to 10, prepared for this war, prepared for this catastrophe that never arrives. And we rarely make the link that our anxiety, our hypervigilance, our depression, our addiction response is connected to our parents and our grandparents. We just think we're wired this way.
Yeah. We just think that's how we are. How did you get involved in this work?
Well, many years ago, without knowing why I was doing what I was doing, I had symptoms that I couldn't explain. You know, I always like to say many of us are living with this mystery, these feelings, this depression, this anxiety, these symptoms, and we have no clue as to what's going on. For me, 30 years ago, I began to lose the vision in one of my eyes. And I went to the doctors and I was diagnosed with this chronic form of retinopathy. And the doctors then told me that there was no cure for it. And the way that it was progressing, because I had it in both eyes, I would likely lose the vision in the other eye too. And here I am thinking that I'm going to be completely blind and there's no cure. And Western medicine at the time, even now, has no cure for it. So I was desperate to find some help. And I went on a search for healing. What that meant is I'd hear somebody talk, or I learned of somebody that I thought had answers, or I read a book. Anyway, this search leads me halfway around the globe, as far as Indonesia, where I learned from several wise teachers who taught me some fundamental principles, one of which is the importance of healing my relationship with my parents. My parents. But before I could do that, I had to heal what stood in the way, inherited family trauma, which I don't realize that at the time, but specifically the anxiety that I had inherited from each of my grandparents, all of whom were orphaned in some way. 3 of them lost their mothers when they were babies, and the 4th grandparent lost her father when she was 1. So ultimately, she would have lost her mother in the grief. And this anxiety was the real cause of my vision loss. I remember, just like my parents, I had inherited this feeling of being broken from my mother's love. And this was what had been passed down in my family because, of course, they all lose their mothers. And I remember being a small boy, maybe I'm 5 or 6 years old, and I feel panicked every time my mom would leave the house, and I'd run into her room and I'd cry. I'd open her drawers and cry into her scarves and her nightgowns, thinking that I'd never see her again, and that her smell would be the only thing that I had left, which would have been true for my grandparents who all lose their moms when they're little. All they would have had was some piece of clothing or blanket, with a mother's smell. 40 years later, I shared this with my mom. I said, Mom, when you'd leave, I used to cry into your clothes. And she said, oh, I did that too when my mother left the house. And then my sister, reading the book, said, honey, I did the same thing when Mom left the house too. I cried into her clothes. So really, this was the family pattern that we're all inheriting, this feeling of we'll never have our mother. And, it led to a broken attachment. And so after healing this broken attachment with my mom, a strange thing happened, Janey. My vision came back, my sight came back.
Wow.
And then afterwards, I felt compelled to share these principles that I had learned. And ultimately, I developed this method for healing the effects of inherited family trauma.
Incredible. So from what you've just described then, and certainly from some of the work that I've seen with family constellations, it's important then to be connected, or at least to know some information about your family of origin. I mean, what about for people who maybe don't, if you hadn't have known or hadn't have had a way of knowing that had happened, if you see what I mean, what happens then? Is it how important is it to know exactly what the stories or the realities were for the past generations?
It's important if we have the information, but just as you said, Janey,
you might not have it.
Yeah, a lot of us don't have it because we're adopted, or our parents don't talk about the past, or our parents are deceased. But what I've discovered is this information lives in our trauma language, both our verbal and our nonverbal trauma language. So it's in our fears, it's in our unexplained symptoms, it's in our self-destructive behaviors, it's in our self-sabotaging behaviors. It lives in the symptoms of an illness or the symptoms of our addiction that appear after maybe an unsettling event takes place. It lives in our relationship struggles, the repeated ways we deal with partners, the way we deal with money, the way we deal with success. All of this can give us a glimpse of what may have happened in our family, even if that story's been lost or kept secret, and can help us explain why we feel the way we feel.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
It's interesting, isn't it? Just as a kind of side note that, years and years ago, people probably would have, sat around as families and shared stories and passed these stories on from generation to generation. But you're right, in our culture, we don't tend to do that. I remember a friend of mine always trying to get his dad to share stuff about the war that he was in, about the Second World War. And he just wouldn't talk about it. It just absolutely closed off. But actually, it would have been super helpful for everyone if that conversation could have been had.
Absolutely. Any way we cut it, memories of trauma, memories of our parents' traumas are imprinted in their sperm cells and egg cells. And that goes for our grandparents too. And then this information passes forward to us. And then as a result, you and I can be born with altered brains that prepare us to biologically cope with traumas that are similar to the traumas that our parents experienced or our grandparents are experienced, or in the case you talk about, the war trauma that his father experienced.
Yeah, absolutely. And how come, some people seem to have a lot of issues with this, and some people don't. Not everyone manifests with this, or at least we don't know on the surface.
No, that's absolutely true. So what I've seen, most of us have trauma in our family history, but you're right. What is that piece? What seems to anchor these traumas? Why do some of us seem to manifest them? What creates these repetitions? So what I see is when traumas aren't talked about or the healing is incomplete, which is common because the pain is too great, the grief is too great, the embarrassment, the shame. People don't, we run away from what's uncomfortable and we move toward what's easy. But that leaves unresolved traumas in our family history. Or what I also see is people in our family history or our family system, they're excluded or rejected. For example, we don't talk about alcoholic grandpa who drank away all the money, left grandma with 5 kids. We just dislike him and we don't want to be like him. So whenever there's not any resolution, then aspects of these traumas can show up in later generations. In other words, unconsciously, we'll repeat the pattern or we'll share a similar unhappiness or a similar behavior until that trauma finally has a chance to heal. Hey, Freud observed this over 100 years ago when he talked about repetition compulsion, the idea that traumas will continue until that trauma has a chance to seek a better outcome. I look at it this way. The contraction of the trauma is always seeking its expansion, which is so the trauma really gives us an opportunity for healing for ourselves, healing for our family, healing for our children.
Yeah. And so, obviously the question everyone's going to want to know the answer to is then how do we heal then? And first off, at what point do most people sort of maybe even start to recognize, okay, there might be something going on here? How can they then begin to heal?
Okay, so you're asking me 2 good questions, and I think they both deserve. Let me start with how do we recognize it in ourselves, and then let me go to how we heal. I think that's a good
great. Thank you.
Sequence. So how do we recognize it? That we can be born with an anxiety or a depression. That's true, and we can never separate it from the events of the previous generation, which is true. We don't think about that. But we can also experience a fear or a symptom that strikes suddenly or unexpectedly, maybe when we reach a certain age, age 30 in the family. Maybe age 30 was the age grandpa died and grandma was a widow and she never marries again. Or it can also happen not just at ages. It can happen at certain milestones or certain events in our lives. For example, as soon as we get married, that can be a triggering event. In the book, you remember I talked about this woman. She loves her fiance. She thinks he's the greatest guy in the world. But then as soon as she's married, she feels trapped and she doesn't understand it. So when we looked in her family history, we saw that both grandmothers had been given away as child brides, one at age 9 and one at age 12 in Iraq, to much older men. And then what was further interesting were the traumas expressed differently in both her sisters. The one sister married a man 30 years older, like the grandmothers, and the other sister refused to even date at all, lest she be trapped. So one trigger can be when we go to get married. Another trigger can be when we move to a new place. And then suddenly we feel depressed, even if we moved across town, because our ancestors, maybe when they lived in a country, perhaps they were persecuted or they were forced out of their homeland. And, they never, they always longed for their family members who were left behind, or the people who died, or they moved to this new place where they felt like foreigners. So, that could be a triggering event, moving. Or we get rejected by our partner. And even if we only dated this partner for 3-4 months, all of a sudden we feel this grief is insurmountable. But it's not that grief because we weren't with that partner that long. It's taking us back to a much earlier grief, perhaps a break in the attachment with our mothers when we were little.
Yeah.
Another triggering event can be having a child. And then there's this ancestral alarm clock that starts ringing inside us and saying, misery, pain. I one time worked with this woman. She was consumed with anxiety and she had no idea what was going on. For example, I said, let's ask some questions here. Let's look at this anxiety. When did it start? And she said, I don't know, 7 months ago. And I said, what happened 7, 8, 9 months ago? And she said, well, that's when I got pregnant. And I said, what's the worst fear that you have about being pregnant or having a baby? And immediately she said, I'll harm my baby. I'll harm my baby. That's my fear. And I asked her if she'd ever harmed a baby. And she said, of course not. And then I said, did anyone in your family ever harm a baby? And she's just about to say no. And then this memory arises and she says, oh, wait a minute. My grandmother, when she was a young woman, she lit a candle and then that caught the curtains on fire and the house on fire, but the baby was upstairs sleeping and she couldn't get the baby out. And then she said, but we were never allowed to talk about it. Right. And in that moment, that's what I talked about earlier with you, is when situations or people are exiled or pushed away or not allowed to be talked about or not allowed to be resolved. In that moment, she made the link that she was carrying the terror from her grandmother's life, and then we could break the pattern. So absolutely. Those are ways in which we can tell if we're carrying trauma. And then your other question, which is really important, how do we heal? So healing, it's not that difficult. It's not that difficult. I mean, healing for inherited trauma or early trauma is still the same. We've got to have positive experiences that can change our brain. And then we need to practice the new feelings and the new sensations that arise, that are associated with these new positive experiences. So, and then when we do that, we create new neural pathways in our brain. That's part of how we heal. But also we stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters in our brain, serotonin, dopamine, GABA. We also stimulate the release of feel-good hormones in our body, estrogen, oxytocin, even the very genes involved in our body's stress response can begin to function in a different way. I just want to tell the listener, we can change the way our DNA expresses. So these positive experiences can be practices that we have to continue practicing, practices of receiving comfort. That can be a practice. Or receiving support. That can be a practice. I teach that in the book. Or I also teach how to have feelings of compassion for ourselves, for what we went through, or for our parents for what they went through, our grandparents for what they went through. Or it can be, these practices can be a gratitude practice. Yeah. Like Oprah used to tell us. Oprah used to say, have a gratitude practice. Well, why? Because these types of experiences feed the prefrontal cortex and can help us reframe the stress response so it has a chance to downregulate. Also a loving kindness practice or mindfulness, really anything that allows us to feel strength or peace or joy inside, because these experiences, as I said, can feed the prefrontal cortex and help us calm that stress response. So ultimately, the idea is to pull energy away or traction away from the limbic brain, the limbic system, our overactive amygdala, and bring energy, bring engagement to the forebrain, specifically the prefrontal cortex again, where we can integrate these new experiences and our brains can change. You know, Janey, we know from mindfulness studies that just practicing mindfulness can actually shrink the amygdala and thicken the cortex, the prefrontal cortex.
Thank you, Mark. So don't forget that family constellation session is in Hertfordshire. Don't miss out if you get a chance to come to one of these. We also do them online. You can always message me, follow me on social media at Janey Lee Grace. You can find me there. And if you want connection and support, don't forget we have the Sober Club. It's thesoberclub.com. If you click on events, you'll find all the info there for family constellations. I guess I should say Happy New Year, whatever stage you're listening to this. Well, happy 23.
You've been listening to the Natural Health and Sobriety Show on UK Health Radio.